Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this conversation. Very timely, very excited to have this conversation with Raffi. If you followed AI conversations over the past 2 years, you've probably heard the same question over and over about who has the best model. But lately, we've all wondered if that question is the wrong question. It's becoming the wrong question. Our guest today argues that the future of AI won't be decided only by who builds the smartest model, but by who builds the ecosystem around it, how we deploy the AI, who controls it, who can access it, and ultimately who benefits from it. Joining us to unpack all this is Raffi Krikorian, the Chief Technology Officer at Mozilla. Throughout his career, from leading engineering teams at Twitter to working on autonomous vehicles at Uber and now shaping Mozilla's vision, Raffi has spent his career thinking about how technology moves from breakthrough to infrastructure and what that means for the rest of us. Today, we'll talk about Mozilla's new State of Open Source AI report, why open models are catching up faster than many expected, why the next AI battle may not be about models at all, and what all of this means for businesses, governments, and everyday users like us. Raffi, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you.
Such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Right. So I want to open with this one word in your report that's really stayed with me: hobbyist. The exact sentence says that open source AI is not a hobbyist ecosystem. It's a multi-$100 billion commercial layer. So just to set the stage, I think we should debunk this hobbyist and get into what is the state of open source AI at the moment? What were your key findings? What are the leading models? What has changed?
Well, there's a lot of things packed in there, so maybe I'll take a few of them and we can drag that through the rest of the conversation. I mean, when you talk about open source in certain circles, usually governmental policy circles, they usually then would say things like, oh, it's just some kid in the basement, right? Like who's actually writing all this code. And I think like part of what we wanted to tell the story of when we put around the state of open source AI was that this ecosystem, similar to the ecosystem that built the internet, similar to the ecosystem that built Linux, is not just kids in their basement hacking around. Like businesses are building huge economies and building infrastructure and building products and building technology that the world can then be assembling together. So before we go into open source, like or open source AI, let's talk about Linux, for example. Like, Linux started off with just Linus sending an email saying something like, I'm going to start working on a kernel, not going to take it very seriously. But like now, N years later, for all practical purposes, every computer on the planet runs Linux, and then there are a few Apple machines around. But like, it means that like Google was able to take Linux and make Android. Samsung is able to take Linux and put it on TVs. Every single new vending machine probably is running Linux on a Raspberry Pi, like on the back end. So like Linux is like a good canonical example of just like, these aren't hobbyists, these are actually real industries. So we're seeing the same thing in the open source, open weight AI world, where like these are large, massive companies who are doing the model work. But when it comes to the people building also the agentic frameworks, the people who are building the RAG systems, the people who are building all the technology around them, these are well-capitalized startups. These are entrepreneurs who are on the pathway to making a real business. There is a multitude of business models that are showing up. Like there are SaaS services, product services, infrastructure providers. Like it is because of the marketing blitz of the big frontier labs that we all view AI just as something that Anthropic, OpenAI, and a few other people are doing. But there's actually a burgeoning ecosystem on the open source, open weight side that a lot of people actually do know about. It's actually potentially one of the best well-kept secrets right now when it comes to technology. So if we're to talk about just generally a few of the key findings, and then we can delve into any single part of that. The first is, like you were saying again in the beginning, that models might not be where the biggest opportunities lay or the biggest conversations lay, Kimi and things like that showing up this week aside. But if you were to look at the capabilities of the open models versus the closed models, if we were to look right now, it's something that they call a jagged frontier. Like on certain tasks there, the closed models are significantly better than the open models. But I think what we're arguing in the piece, and I think the data backs it up, is that for the 80% use case, and I put that in air quotes, like let's call that the everyday use cases of managing a calendar, summarizing a web page, writing some code. I think for those, it seems to be that the open models are just as capable as the frontier models. In fact, you can make an argument that using the frontier models is kind of like driving a Ferrari to the grocery store. Like it is way overpowered for the kind of thing that you want to go do. And these open models are doing just well. So number one is that in most cases, and Kimi being the exception, because Kimi might be even closer on the frontier side, but for the 80% everyday use case, the open models are just as capable. So that was number one. Number two is that it's the world already knows this. So like that was actually one of the biggest surprises to us, that they're just not talking about it. If you look at places like OpenRouter, which is it's a company that runs what's called a proxy. So you talk to OpenRouter and then it talks to a model for you. And a vast majority of people deploying AI into production use something like OpenRouter. OpenRouter's own data that they're publishing shows that the vast majority of traffic is moving toward these open models, probably for performance reasons and definitely for cost reasons, in the sense that like it's about 20 to 50x cheaper to make a call to an open model than it is to make a call to a closed one right now. And traffic is moving. Traffic is probably moving because we're in a different spot in the innovation curve. Like if you looked at it maybe 12 months ago, 18 months ago, people were still experimenting. People are doing that today, but more people were experimenting, trying to figure out how to get AI into their workflows. But the way that we read the data is that people are starting to figure it out. Like they figured out which workflows they want to AI enable. They figured out which workflows they want to move to these like intelligence systems. And once you've figured it out and you're no longer in the exploration stage, you get into the optimization stage. So people are figuring out like the right model for at the right time, at the right price point. And those tend to be open models. So maybe that's the number two biggest finding that we found interesting. And then the number three is sort of like this notion of people are looking for a sense of sovereignty. And I use sovereignty as a very big word, meaning different things to different people. Like on the government side, the people are starting to do large investments in ways to get out of, let's call it the American supply chain, but trying to figure out how to build these intelligence systems within their own countries, either for, as I said, independence, or because of privacy policies or data locality rules. So governments are starting to invest in them, but also businesses are looking for this sovereignty angle because of June 12th. Like the notion that a company in your chain that you depend heavily on could just be shut off at any moment, regardless of whether a government does it or not, has caused companies to start looking at tiering their different intelligence services, trying to figure out how to get a backup plan of like an open model for the closed model, or only send to the closed model the really hard stuff and move the more traditional stuff to the open model. But that June 12th thing has caused sovereignty, or let's call it maybe choice, to show up in the business conversation, which we found interesting as well. I'll hold there because there's a lot to unpack even on those three, but I'm sure there's more.
A lot to unpack there. I love the term you use about marketing blitz by the big companies, which is sort of taking over the conversation, and everyone is only talking about that. But Ravi, the fact is that from how we understand, most people interact with AI through ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, Copilot. And I wonder if they have any idea about this entirely different AI ecosystem underneath it. So when you said no, that's because nobody is talking about it, but they're using about it. Why is nobody talking about it then?
Well, I think there's a difference between what consumers are doing, which we didn't really touch upon in the report, but we can talk about it here, and what businesses are starting to do. And so it is true that like maybe a person, an admin, a secretary, a white-collar worker at a desk is probably using ChatGPT and Claude, but any of the workflows that your IT team is starting to put together, or any of the workflows that your HR team is starting to put together, those are starting to be migrated, if you look at the data, toward these open models away from the closed models because of price performance reasons, or potentially because of like regulated industries and they want to have full control of their data and how their data flows. So they actually want to self-host and they want things to stay within their firewall. They want architecture to protect their data and not like a privacy statement. They're actually looking for an ability to deploy things under their control. Granted, OpEx and CapEx is complicated in that situation, but they're looking for that. And so regular consumers are still using the ChatGPTs and the Claudes, except for like the truly expert bleeding edge users. Like people like me, I'm constantly dabbling in a bunch of different models for like my day-to-day use cases, whether it be agentic coding or whether it is something to like brainstorm with on a document. But for regular people, they're still using the thing that they can just give a credit card to, because a credible third option hasn't shown up in that chatbot space. But again, in the back end, the back office space, that's where the biggest changes are happening. And I don't have a good answer as to why people aren't shouting from the rooftops that they're saving all this money, that they're doing all this thing. I mean, there was another study that we did cite in the report where the Linux Foundation did a study of, again, spending on open versus closed, and their current their estimate as of 9 months ago, so it's probably worse now, was a couple of $2 billion were being wasted by being spent on the closed models versus the open models, because again, their capabilities are similar and you could just save a whole bunch of money too. So I do think that it is a little bit of it, that people are maybe starting to catch on right now. The marketing blitz is a little bit clouding the conversation on purpose. I mean, they're doing their job. They're trying to capture the market. And then regular people aren't being given another credible choice yet. So there's still a few confounding things. I think the conversation will be, when we do version 2 of the report in a year, I think the conversation will be very different. So we're still seeing the beginnings of it, but like the transition is happening.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Raffi, because this distinction between the report focusing on the back end and not on like what a consumer is doing their math with or doing their homework with, etc., is very important. But and I'll come to the business questions, because when we got people to register and ask them what they want to ask you, a lot of questions were about people wanting to say, I have a business, how can I use open source for? So we'll come to that later in the conversation. But you also said that you wonder why people are not shouting from rooftops, and that flows so well into my next question, because I wonder if it is to do with the fact that which are the most popular Chinese open source models. Your report says that in February 2026, Quen, which is a Chinese model, out-downloaded the next 8 organizations combined.
Yep.
In the past, like I'm right now in Bangalore, in a country where more than 300 Chinese apps are banned because of national security reasons. So this figure or this fact is very astonishing and surprising to me. Do you think that the reason why people are not open about it, or more people are not using it, or consumers are not using it, has to do with users' concern about data privacy when it comes to using Chinese software? Do you think that, I think you mentioned regulations might be playing a role, but could you speak more about that?
Yeah, no, I think you're onto something. We don't have concrete proof that it's true, but I think you're onto something, and we can probably infer that to be true. I mean, I think it's just a little bit of, it's complicated to understand, and I think that is also part of the issue. Like, I'll try to do it simply for a second, but you'll notice that even I won't be able to say it in a very simple way, that like when you look at these models, like downloading something from Hugging Face or downloading a model that you want to run, it's like downloading a file onto your computer. So yeah, I can understand how people might, if they don't truly understand how this technology works, be worried that like, am I just downloading malware that could be giving my data over in some places? That's not how how the systems actually work, but like, the simplest explanation is the one that usually ends up winning. And I also do believe that, something about just China in general is confounding the equation a little bit. Like, I actually look at this as like there's a huge opportunity out there. Like, there's clearly demand for the ability to download a model, run it under my control, run it fully offline if I really wanted to, know where my data is going, etc. Like, there's clearly demand. And honestly, the confounding thing should be, why aren't more countries, why aren't more organizations trying to fill that demand in the grand scheme of things? Like, if all this large amount of traffic is going to a model that people want to be open, then you can imagine a world where like American companies or Indian companies or European companies should also be trying to fill that demand. So part of me putting out this report is to highlight that there's this gap between supply and demand that like I actually would love more people to fill. Like, in the same way that I'm frustrated that the closed providers are centralizing power. Like, right now we have a centralization on the open weight models in a single country. That's also a bad thing. Like, I love open weight models, but centralization generally is a bad thing. We want as much distributed innovation as possible to flourish in the way the internet has allowed it to flourish. So we need more countries to take up this banner. So when I think about like why more people aren't screaming from the rooftops, because it is also still a complicated thing. Like, it's not like a simple thing to talk about. Even the people who manage to go do it, like, we have a bunch of data in the report that talks about how, don't quote me on these exact numbers, look at the report, but like, let's say 80% of people have tried to use open source, but only 30% of them or less actually even got into production with the numbers, and that gap is purely a difficulty gap, in my opinion, of just like, you need to provision GPUs, you need to find someone who's going to make sure the computer's always on, you're going to do the OpEx, CapEx calculation. Like, it's difficult to go do. It's not just giving my credit card to someone. So, maybe you can argue that some people who go through it should be shouting from the rooftops because they did the hard thing. But I don't think that's actually how it's playing out right now.
Yeah. And, in this, that's interesting. And I understand that you don't have answers, but I do, in the same vein of the concerns with China and data privacy and regulations, etc. Do you think the governments, especially Washington, where you are today, understands that this is already happening?
So it's a good question. I mean, like, I do think that the government does understand what is happening, but they're caught in the, do we want to let our current existing standards bearers win? Or do we want to potentially take the risk and try to be a transformative thing to the ecosystem? I think it's a simpler thing. Like, I often look for the simplest answer. So I think it's a very simple thing to comprehend, of just like, we have two companies that are doing incredibly well, that are racing toward IPOs either end of this year or beginning of next year, and we want them to win. So like, they're looking at, and they're being lobbied very heavily on that regard. So the simplest thing to do would be like, back the winners, or back the people they perceive to be the winners already. But I would say that like, Americans generally, have filed intelligence as a category error. Like, they're filing it as a product. Like, products are by definition things that you can rent, things that you can probably turn off. But like, it should be filed as infrastructure, which is what the rest of the world seems to want to buy. And so like, that categorization error is actually the problem. That like, as an American company, you could drive a truck through that categorization error. Like, we should be trying to fill that demand in some way. And I'm frustrated that my government, can't see that distinction right now. But I think they're doing the simple thing.
Great. I want to move the conversation now towards the entire pricing part of the open source AI, which
Sure.
also your report goes into details. And I want to read two sentences from the report again, which I found very fascinating. It said, a metered bill the vendor sets becomes the ceiling on your roadmap. A
Correct.
provider that knows exactly what exit would cost has no reason to stop raising it. And we are meeting right now, Raffi, at a point when this conversation has already started making headlines, and everyone, whether it is in Africa, whether it is in Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, people are discussing about the token prices. And your report also mentions companies that have come out and said, we exhausted the entire year's budget in 3 months, etc. And then, you draw this very interesting analogy of something we have all witnessed with Uber's fares, that Uber's fares rose around 92% after riders reorganized their lives around the subsidized pricing. And you say that the price was never the product, the lock-in was.
Correct.
So do you think then that are we sleepwalking into the same trap with the AI, just at like a civilizational scale at this point?
Oh yeah, no, I think it's even worse than that potentially. I think that if you're correct about the Uber, the Microsofts of like how they blew through their token budget, and I can tell you just even on my day-to-day use, we have a subsidiary at Mozilla that we call the Mozilla AI team, and one of the senior engineers there has been actually doing a lot of measurement of what his usage of agentic coding would look like in a non-subscription-based world. So for those of you who don't know, you can subscribe to things like Claude for $200 a month, and that gives you a lot of access to Claude code. You could, for general everyday usage, you would, in a month, you would be fine. $200 would be fine. But if you did the exact same thing potentially on the APIs, or at least in the case of this one engineer, his estimate was it would cost something like $6,000 to $10,000 of just API calls, and Anthropic is hiding it behind a Claude Code subscription of $200. So I think it's very likely that those costs are going to converge over time. Whether it converges right after the IPO or not is a good question of when profitability becomes super important, when you have shareholder incentives that you need to go manage, that subscription cost either goes up or gets removed, and you have to go on per API cost pricing. Now, there's a lot of evidence that the per API cost is going down, but there's also a lot of evidence that these agentic coding systems just take more tokens. So all that's going to even out, probably at the expense of the person paying, not at the expense of Anthropic or OpenAI. So I think there's a lot to be said about per token pricing being one of the biggest levers. For example, I've talked to companies every day, and so they all ask me about, should we use Claude, should we use open models and stuff like that? And my answer is generally, use a mix of them. You have to better just understand what works for your use case. But I can say for my use case, I spend a lot of times on airplane Wi-Fi, which means I'm basically disconnected. And so I can run a lot of the open models on my laptop while I'm in the air and still get my agentic coding done. And so I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities to start exploring that space a bit more, of just when someone creates the double click installer, that I can get a good model onto my laptop, and I can then fire up my coding environment, and it just generates tokens. And the only cost is it kind of heats up my lap a little bit more as opposed to anything else, because my computer is working on it. I think those will be the interesting things we need to figure out. But getting free of the per token pricing regime is going to be one of the most important things that I think was one of the most important benefits that potentially these open weight models can give you, because you are now in control in a way that I don't know if that token cost is going to change. I don't know how it's going to evolve. But if I can just deploy this on my laptop, I can deploy it into my own server closet, then I can have a real calculation of what my spend is going to look like, and we can actually manage that correctly, as opposed to having it be an unknown that I can walk into. And I do think that this lock-in thing of the subscriptions is a real thing. If you look at the way, if you use Claude for 2 weeks and then you try to switch to ChatGPT, it's like talking to an amnesiac, because Claude has taken all that context that you've talked with it for 2 weeks, and it's locked it behind its own platform walls. It's not something that you can then extract and bring with you to the next agent, to the next LLM that you want to go use. So they are creating a form of lock-in of us oh, but all my context is there. I won't be able to leave. And then, the crazy thing about these systems is that they are going to get really good at pricing. So they're going to figure out that if I charge her $1 more, it's going to leave. But if I charge her 99 cents, she would be annoyed but stay. So these systems are going to start doing crazy pricing on a per person basis to try to figure out exactly what does lock-in cost. So I think the per token pricing regime is going to need to either change, or it's going to remain the big opportunity for the open models.
And I think, Raffi, that's the reason why possibly a reason why when we invited people to ask questions when they were registering, like I told you before we started, the biggest question was about like, what do I do about my business? I will also just take a pause to say, if anybody has questions at this point, please share. Christine is monitoring them, and I'll try to include as many, but I do want to say we had 80 questions. So I'm trying to get through them quickly. So Rafi, if I am a CTO of a mid-sized company right now, and a lot of such people might be already trapped, the word you used, in the entire metered ecosystem, what would they actually do? And I will just quickly sort of also read the few questions about this business that
Sure.
came, because I think the answer is going to be the same. What can I do today? How to get started using open source AI, specs needed, tools, creating a sandbox, how to best deploy an open source model, how can we make open source model AI model more so open source AI more deployable. So I think for people who are already either trapped, the word you used, or who are now sort of thinking that this cost is too much and I need to figure out an alternative way, where do they begin?
Okay, well, let me start with why it's going to be hard, but then let me tell you what to do about it.
Sure,
Like,
sure.
these are not drop-in replacements. Like, you're not like, just like when you move from Claude to ChatGPT to Grok or whatever you want to go use, they all behave differently. So moving from a closed to open, it's going to behave differently. So keep that in mind. The thing I would start to figure out is just trying to experiment. Like, I acknowledge that experimentation takes time, experimentation takes budget, but trying to figure out like what alternatives look like and how they're going to be used is like such a big thing to start to try to do. And, to run an open model, this is actually an important point for most people to understand. To run an open model, you have two options. One is you could download it onto your computer and run it. That's actually the harder option, but that's the one that gives you the most opportunities, the most sovereignty, the most privacy, etc. You can find cloud providers that are hosting open models right now. So if you're a developer, when you call Open Router, for example, you can just specify that you want to go to GLM 5.2 instead of Claude Opus, for example, and then that it'll just route you to an open model instead. And then you'll notice, that it behaves slightly differently, but it's pretty good. Like, I'll happily talk about what my experiences have been using GLM 5.2 or using Kimi K3. And so like, you'll notice there is a difference, but once you get over the difference and adapt your prompts and stuff like that, you'll notice it works almost as well. And then B, the second thing you're gonna notice is your bill is gonna go down a lot, like in the grand scheme of things. Like, my estimate on my own workloads of switching from a closed model to an open model was about a 20x cost reduction. So it was a pretty large drop down for making that change. And yes, I had to do a little bit of upfront work to adapt my workflows to the way that, everything likes the prompt to be slightly different. So to make my prompts work on the open models versus closed models. In fact, it's unfair to say make my prompts work on an open model. It's just like make my prompts work on a different model, regardless of open close. Like, once I did that adaptation, it's about 25x cheaper to make that change on my workload. So I think that everyone else can experience that. So if you're a developer, talking to Open Router and switching from there is one example of how to go do it. And if you're not a developer, or another option is like, if you look at these big companies, I don't want to. I'm not shilling for any particular company, but cloud providers like the Nebiuses of the world and others also have different options for what you want to go use at any given time. And people have started now creating web interfaces to the open models as well. So you can actually start to get a real feel of what it's like to use instead of just going to like Claude.ai or ChatGPT.com. You can go to like these alternative interfaces which have drop downs, and you can just switch which model you're using and start tinkering with those. So for me right now, my biggest encouragement for people is to like just explore the ecosystem, explore how it can work on your workloads. I'm not even saying change today, but if June 12th were to happen again, that way you know what you're getting into. You can quickly switch as opposed to waiting and trying to figure it out in the scramble.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Interesting. But I know the report doesn't focus on individual users, but could you, Rafi, also in the same way, like I asked if I'm a CTO of a mid-sized company right now, Could you, in the same sense, same sort of track, also respond for individual users? Because a lot of individual users are like individual developers and not companies, and their costs are also rising. Like, my reporter recently, I was editing a draft, has spoken to a VC in investor in Bangalore, who is saying that he also needs to experience before he invests, right? And then he's burning thousands of dollars every week. So what is the roadmap for that? I know the report doesn't cover it, but anything that you have to say about individuals?
Yeah, this is where we need some better alternatives to show up. And I have faith that the open source ecosystem will catch up in a similar way to it was a few years after, iMessage, WhatsApp, etc., that things like Signal showed up in order to be an open alternative that also was private and things like that. And so we're starting to see the beginnings of that now. There's some pretty interesting projects, Open Web UI being one of them, that actually allows you to connect to any backend provider. It'll gladly connect to an closed or an open provider. And it looks physically looks on your web page like what you would expect from a ChatGPT or a Claude interface. It just has a drop down that allows you to choose an open model behind. So I would encourage people to look for those open interfaces that developers are starting to stand up right now if they're looking for that one-click way to get a feel of it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I'm going to push a little bit about open source, very respectfully, Raffi. But you're Mozilla, right? You
Sure.
championed the open web for decades.
Sure.
And the open web still exists, but Google has 90% of search, and
100%.
Meta has captured social media, and Amazon runs most of the cloud. So open won technically, but lost commercially, if I could say it like that. Why should anyone believe that open source AI could end or will end differently?
Yeah, no, it's such a great question. And look, I think that yes, the usage of things like Firefox is a de minimis amount of the internet. And by de minimis, I mean hundreds of millions of users, but not the not the population of the earth. So it's still a large, significant number of users are using things like Firefox compared to the rest. But the existence of things like Firefox has moved the entire industry, right? Someone like a Google can't build a closed version of the web because the vocal community of Firefox users will rise up and be like, you just can't do that. Those type of numbers are enough to force and keep the internet in an open protocol state, and one that doesn't benefit any particular user, any particular company at that base infrastructure level. So I want the exact same dynamic to occur on the internet, on the AI internet. So I think it's entirely possible. You could make an argument that we get a small amount of traffic on the AI internet that's running through the open models, but that would be enough to force a conversation around model choice, about agentic harness choice, about user agency, making sure that memory stays on my side, not the user side. Now, you could make the argument that it only takes a small amount of traffic to pull that off. But I'm also saying a large amount of traffic is already moving to the open model. So it is possible that we end up in the same place that the internet ended up, which is the open providers are a small but significant part of it. But right now, the open usage, at least in the back office commercial sense, a good chunk of it, nearly a majority of it, is running toward the open state. So we're actually in a better state when it comes to that open closed balance right now. We're just again having it all masked through the marketing channels, and so we don't see it, but the data is starting to show it.
Fascinating. We have a question from Nora Young, who's on the call, and which was also a question that came up in the other, the questionnaire that we'd sent out, is about the risk of open source AI. Where do ethics and guardrails fit into open source AI? And Nora asks, can Raffi speak to open source AI and cybersecurity? On the one hand, open models are generally considered more secure, but on the other hand, guardrails are supposedly easy to remove.
Yeah, no, I mean, so I think I think we can have that conversation. That I think that open models it's open weight models is a little bit confusing where the data has come from, what the data situation looks like, then also what you could do with those models. But I would argue that that's the situation we're in right now. So instead, I don't think the answer is to be like, we are going to only trust a certain set of corporations to guard what the models can go do, because I don't think you can shut down that open ecosystem. What you should be doing instead, and the places that we should be investing in, is how do we create open sets of guardrails? How do we create open sets of evaluation frameworks so we can truly understand what's going on? Open detection tools. I rather have an entire ecosystem of people trying to figure out how to secure what's occurring out there in the world, than instead of trusting two companies and trying to use their fiat position to try to lock out the rest of the ecosystem, which I don't believe is going to go work. So I think actually a better place for us to end up, rather than, again, trusting two companies and fingers crossed, is that we actually enable lots of people to start building what those guardrail systems look like, understanding what data provenance looks like, understanding how we can actually deploy these things into production safely and usefully. How do we make sure we manage the dual use risk properly? I rather have more people looking at this than less. So I think actually open is a beneficial way for us to actually get to a safer spot than it is to truly just allow, again, trusting two companies, two CEOs to actually do it globally.
Yeah. Raffi, can you speak to what's happening about it so far in terms of like guardrails and security? What have you seen in the open space that is already happening? Like, any measures that have been put in place? What are the conversations like?
Yeah, so if you look at things that like what Mozilla, our subsidiary company, Mozilla AI, is doing, like we've actually put out a library out there that we called Any Guardrail. And so like we're actually allowing for any company's guardrail systems to be plugged in a uniform way so that we can actually get a multiplicative effect of like what all the work in guardrails are. So there's actually a lot of work and a lot of cybersecurity companies, a lot of privacy companies, etc., that are starting to be spun up to look at this problem, because I don't think it's also a unique problem to the open world. It's a problem across the entire thing. Like people are starting to ask questions around PII leakage. People are starting to ask questions around questionable imagery that's being generated and stuff like that. So lots of people are starting to build pieces of software to tackle different parts of the problem. What Mozilla is trying to do here is trying to figure out how to we don't want to be the central player. That's never been our goal. But how do we make it even easier for lots of people to stack these pieces of software together? Because each individual vendor is going to look at, or each individual product is going to look at one particular thing. Again, whether it be PII leakage, or whether it be CSAM imagery, or whether it be something else. But we need to figure out how we're going to tie that all together so that we can uniformly apply a lot of guardrails to this stuff. So Any Guardrail is one of the open source libraries Mozilla has put out in order to try to like unify that ecosystem a bit. But there's a whole industry right now looking at these problems.
The other question again about open source AI in general, and this was also a question that an audience member brought, but also I was also intrigued by it. Is open source AI really open source for everyone, Raffi? And I come from, I represent Rest of World. We are an organization that's focused on telling stories about tech's impact on the non-Western world. I work with people on stories from Africa and from Latin America and from the Gulf and Southeast Asia. From that perspective, this question is very critical for me and for my reader. What is your view on this, like geographically? Because AI right now, like you have been saying, there's concentration and there's two big companies, or there's one country or two countries that are leaders. Is this getting replicated in the open source AI world also, or is open source really open?
Such a great question. I think there's a few things going on here. So let me try to take it one at a time. One, there's like, what's the true definition of open source in this context? And I will admit, we are sort of like glossing over the open source, open weights conversation. So, there is the strictest definition, which is an open source system, which in my mind would come down to understanding all the data that went to train it, all the evaluation systems, what pre-training, post-training look like, understanding that truly end to end. And I think that's incredibly important, and we need to actually invest even more in making that happen, because if we can have that, then we can have true let's call it trust and transparency into what's going into these systems, and then we can ethically feel really good about them. Right now, a lot of what we've been talking about are these open weight systems. So like we don't have a good sense of all the data pre-training, post-training, but what we do have is the ability to download, run, execute, and then modify and fine-tune on top of. And I think that that fine-tune on top of is where the rest of the world comes into play. So if you look at the opening letter we wrote for the State of Open Source report, we actually talked about how there are people in New Zealand, the Maori, who are training, who are doing a fine tuning so they can do language versions for their Maori languages. If you look at places like where you are, again, like India, there are definitely sub-regions of the country that only 3 million people speak that language, like kind of thing. And so I think the pathway for us to actually have really local models and really local AI that actually reflect the value of users is to take these big open weight models and fine tune them to our use cases. And so fine tune them to the language that we speak, fine tune them to the values of what my community are. Now, the technology there still needs work. Like if you are a computer scientist, you can probably do it. If you're a community leader, you probably couldn't. Now, that being said, there are lots of people, like amazing entrepreneurs like Sarah Hooker, who are trying to build systems to make that even easier for less and less computer science literate people to actually go do. And so like maybe in the next 12 to 18 months, that becomes more of a possibility. But the only path in my mind toward that are these open weight systems, because again, I'm not faulting what the big companies are doing, but the big companies are going to optimize for the places that they can make the most money. And so they're going to optimize for Western world, the North Americas of the world, they're maybe the Asia side of the world, but they're not going to optimize for rest of the world. So I think rest of the world only becomes part of this bigger AI transformative conversation through the open source and open weight ecosystem, frankly.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What about the funding and some sustainability models of open source AI? Because like you said, we have two big companies that are heading towards IPO. That says something about the need for funds and the amount of funds that they need. Let's just focus on funding for a moment. I'll come to sustainability in the next question. But in terms of fundings for open source AI, what can you tell us, and what is the direction that it's going in, and what's the future?
Well, if we look at, I'll just take one example and we can pull from there. Like if we look at something like what Mira Murati did recently, where she released her Inkling model. Her Inkling model is one that's actually designed to be fine-tuned. It's designed to be customized and trained on data so that you can use it in your use case, your community, your language, etc. But what she's selling is she's actually selling the infrastructure to fine-tune it. And so like, I think there's going to be, again, we're all viewing this world through the lens of the big model providers and their business model, which is selling you access to the model. But I think there's going to be a whole other ecosystem around these models that's going to be incredibly vibrant, whether it be that fine-tuning ecosystem, the serving ecosystem, the services needed, because like the detriment on the business side is like when you deploy an open source model or when you deploy open source software, companies still want someone they can sue when things go wrong. So like the services around actually selling, running those models, I think there's going to be all these different niche business plans, business models that are going to show up around that open source ecosystem that's going to make a lot of money. Again, we've seen this on the internet, right? The internet is built fully on open protocols, yet trillions of dollars of market cap has been made from routers, from applications, American companies doing innovation, global companies doing their thing. I think all that stuff is going to start to add up, but that model layer could potentially be the part that gets a little more commoditized. Now, that being said, like even if the model layer becomes commoditized, that's probably going to be for the 80% use case. I think for that frontier use case, there's actually a lot of money still to be made. Like I want people working on deep AI solutions to protein folding, drug discovery, quantum computing, all the stuff that can truly move our society forward. And I think, again, a lot of money can be made there. But for that, like regular use case, translating between two people, summarizing an email, I think the commoditization of that of that intelligence layer is fine, because those applications and those businesses on top of it is what's going to make all the money.
Great. Andrew in chat had asked about the efficiency of OSS, the push toward like requiring less capital. I think this answers
Sure.
that to a great extent. We have another question. Yeah, sure.
And to be clear, I think like that efficiency question is on the inference side, right? Like I think it's significantly cheaper to run these models and potentially perform it, because like if you take my example earlier of like, do you want to drive a Ferrari to the grocery store? I mean, I do want to drive a Ferrari to the grocery store, but like it's kind of annoying. It's kind of annoying to do it because it's very expensive. You're worried it's going to break. And like if you take that analogy on the model side, like these models, it's going to be very expensive. And the models are a little bit slower because they're doing so much when all you want to do is shop for groceries. Whereas the beauty of the open source side is then you can like narrow it down and make it super efficient for that one thing you want to go do. So I think there is also a bunch of efficiency savings there, which has the trickle down effect of power and all this other stuff.
Let's go to sustainability now that I brought it up earlier, but there's a question in the chat also about the environmental standards of open source options, since like the environmental costs of AI value chain is increasingly a concern. What do we know about that as of now?
Well, I know we didn't do an exhaustive study on this, so I can't say it definitively, but what I will say is that the beauty of the open source system is that we can then actually examine it and we can actually then understand it. Like I can now know exactly how many tokens a second my particular GPU on my laptop can generate and how much power it's going to take to do that. Right now, when we talk about the amount of power, the amount of energy, the data center capabilities that the big frontier labs need, they're not telling us the exact details. Like that's, we're just seeing what their costs look like. We're seeing it show up in our communities, etc. The beauty of the open source one is that we can actually measure it on a per use case basis. So it's a great idea. We should maybe do that study as when we do version 2 of the report. But I think like transparency is going to be the biggest opportunity when it comes to the open source model, so we can actually measure what that will look like.
I want to go back to the report again, Raffi. It ends with this line, and this is not the last question, but I was at the end of the report. It ends with a line about look at who was seated in the rooms where AI gets decided. Today, it's the people who own the engines. And I was very curious, who is not in these rooms right now and who should be? And what happens if they never get a seat?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question. Like, I mean, like I was looking at, the G7 summit, or when you look at the AI Impact Summit that happened in India, or the one that's going to happen in Geneva next year, like the default people who show up are the people running the big frontier labs. But what's not there are the people who are either using it or providing the systems that power the rest of us, like what that 80% use case looks like. So I worry that if we don't start having those voices in the room, in with the government ministers, people doing massive funding, etc., that this imbalance will continue to happen over time. And like, for me, it just strikes itself as odd that these countries who are simultaneously talking about sovereignty of like their value chain or for their data or for their populations are then entertaining, I understand why they're doing it, but are then only having the people providing the closed, centralized solutions in the room with them, where instead they should be having community voices, the open source providers, the people who are actually trying to enable diffusion of this capability instead of centralization of the capability. So unless we have those people in the room, I think we're going to remain in this like dichotomy of just like all the conversation is going to be about the centralized, but in the back rooms, like we're starting to see a lot of that diffusion occur. And I would rather in the front room talk about diffusion, in the front room talk about how we spread this to everyone, in the front room talk about how we actually get this under control to be inspectable, transparent, etc. So that's what I was implying by that end line there.
Another question that I kept wondering as I read the report was about the place of open source AI in the corporate world globally, and what's the future of that? Because, what is the trend of enterprise level adoption? Because a lot of companies, as we see right now, I don't think even have a very clear strategy. And sometimes, I'll ask big employees of big companies, different teams are doing different things. There are restrictions about what you can't do, but not always like guidelines. So do you think that open source could be a solution there, and has it matured enough to sort of, reach the level of a enterprise level adoption?
I absolutely think it can be a solution. The question you're asking, though, is the right one. It's just like, is the technology in a state that can be easily
Yeah.
deployed? And I don't think that is true yet. I think we showed through our developer survey that there is a lot of desire to go do it, but there are still barriers in place of like poor documentation, or I don't have the talent needed to pull it off, or I don't know which vendor in which to call. So I think there is still a whole bunch of barriers in order to pull it off. However, I would say that the open source systems are what actually provides you the control that most of those companies are looking for. So, I've spoken to legal law firms all the way to like legal advocacy groups, etc., who have talked about how they don't want to use the big model providers because, yes, there is a privacy policy in place, but there's no architecture that protects what they're up to. So they're worried about confidentiality. But if they could deploy it locally, then they would know that their data isn't going anywhere except to that one GPU that's in their closet that they can just unplug at the worst moment, if they really needed to. But is the software at a place that a law firm's IT team can get it in place? Maybe. Like, I'm not saying no, but it's definitely not a slam dunk yes. And so, like, I think those are the gaps. But those are the gaps. But again, I think if you just look at what demand seems to be, the data shows that demand is for these open models. Demand seems to be that people want to try to run it under their own terms. Demand seems to be that they want local control. That supply will figure it out. It's just a question of how fast and when. It's just not probably, sadly, right now, but people are starting to see it as an opportunity. Now, Pinterest is my example that I go to all the time. So Pinterest in Q3 of last year announced how they moved from the closed models to open models and saved $10 million in that quarter, making that change. Now, Pinterest is a large software organization with talented software engineers who could probably customize and etc. But that was also in Q3 of last year. That was nine months ago. So the world is changing, but we need to figure out, that double-click install, how to make these rounded corners instead of sharp corners on these products. All this stuff still needs to be done, and that's part of my hope in putting out this report, is to demonstrate not just to people, not just to CIOs and CTOs that there is potentially a valid other option out there, but for this to be a call to developers of like, there is demand, like people will actually want to pay you for this if you actually start building in this way.
I have one more question in the chat. Let me just quickly grab that. Do we know about the take-up of open source options in the context of governance solutions? We are particularly concerned about the massive presence of Microsoft supporting the digital transformation of UN institutions.
Sure.
And they do say that it's a very specific question, but if you have any comments about it.
I don't have specific data, but I will acknowledge that this is something we've been hearing a lot as well. So I don't know about pure adoption, but I can tell you that we are hearing about demand, because for what exactly you said, of just like, there has already been a bunch of PTSD around the lock-in, around the docx format and stuff like that, that people want to move to these more open formats. And even then, like, it's been difficult to do it. So they're trying to figure out ways around it. So, Mozilla has been asked in many different situations because, we provide things like Thunderbird as an open email solution. So we've been asked as well. So I can confirm there's a lot of demand for it, but I haven't seen large-scale adoption for it yet. But I think it is purely for this, what we've been talking about. Like, there isn't a double-click install. There isn't a clear vendor you can call to go do it. Like, they don't even know how to write the RFP in a way that would make a lot of sense yet. So, like, there is a bunch of education on that government buyer side, and then we need to fulfill that demand. So, again, I'm optimistic because we're starting to see the seedlings, but that market needs to be met.
I'm on my last question, and let's carry that optimism, Raffi, where let's fast forward 5 years and imagine your report is completely right. and everything, the trends that we're seeing continue. What's the biggest AI company in 2031 doing today that most people aren't paying attention to? Is it building models? Is it building memory, developer tools, agent, infrastructure, or is it something entirely different?
I think it's diffusion. I think like the biggest thing in 5 years, if I am right, is that every company on the planet is trying to figure out how, like similar to how we all now have, a Google Drive subscription, or we all have like a Microsoft Office 365 solution, is that we are going to be finding that the biggest provider is the one who provides an open version of intelligence that every single company can then use and help them customize it. Not just simply a hand me a check and a hope I get something better, but like actually a services provider that can then walk into a company and help them actually get over that hump and go use it. I don't know what that really looks like. Is it like Best Buy's Nerd Squad that's actually like deployed across the world in a way, or is it an Accenture that's working with the bigger companies? But I think that intelligence provider of like deploying systems that's under your control, that guarantees your privacy, that it's not going to change over time, that no one else can pull the switch on, is going to be potentially one of the biggest market opportunities out there.
Great. Thank you so much, Raffi. We have reached the end of this conversation. Always so much to learn from you. Thank you for the report. Thank you for making the time to be here. And we'll keep this conversation going because, like I said, like at Rest of World, we care about the covering tech in the rest of the world. And I think open source models might have, open source AI might have solutions to the challenges that many of our entrepreneurs, our companies, individuals face. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who joined us. We will keep you posted about our future events, and also hope to bring Raffi back when they do a version 2 or another report. Thank you. Thank you, Raffi. Bye-bye. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you for having me.